Thanks very much, Chair. This is the first exchange of views in this committee on this ECB report. As I see it, of course, we're dealing with the crisis, and the ECB has become more present when it comes to institutional readjustment and when it comes to the various tools which have been rolled out in response to the crisis we are still undergoing in the EU. The ECB report for 2011 really does reflect the changes we have witnessed in the EU policy when it comes to fighting the crisis. This year was described by the very president of the ECB as an exceptional year, one marked by clear economic circumstances. Real growth in the EU was 1.5% in 2011. That meant a deceleration compared to 2010. Further, when it comes to the annual ECB report in and of itself, I think we can identify two very different blocks. In the first 6 months, the ECB's actions could be deemed absurd or even silly. In the second 6 months, the situation was different. The ECB tried to correct the mistakes made in the first 6 months. I'm saying this because we are all aware that in the first 6 months the ECB raised the interest rates in April and in August. These hikes were reflected by a change of 50 basis points. At the end of the year, we saw that the ECB lowered the interest rates to the same degree. Well, what happened? In the first 6 months, even though the average inflation rate was above that in 2010, 2.7% compared to 2.6% in the previous year, what did the ECB do? Well, as I said, it acted in a rather silly fashion when it came to interest rates. It responded to situational inflation. This was not a structural inflation. So I think the ECB shot itself in the foot. In the second 6 months, it corrected its course, and at the end of the year, they lowered the interest rates. However, there was a problem with the expansionist policy of the ECB in the second 6 months. If we carefully look at the annual report, this expansionist policy did not have a knock-on effect on the increase in credit to companies or loans to families. There's a very simple reason, as I see it, because this policy was implemented in the current situation of policies of austerity and salary containment, and due to the inefficiency of the expansionist policy pursued in the second 6 months by the ECB. Well, we need to be careful when we look at this report. There are two main things to be identified. Firstly, as to the actual mandate of the ECB, we need to see whether it's a good idea for the ECB's mandate to be tied to an inflationary goal, regardless of the consequences this goal could have for growth or employment. Just by way of example, looking at the fundamental needs to get out of stagnation in the EU, there needs to be increases in salaries in the economies of the centre of the Eurozone. Why? Well, this increase would allow for two things to take place. It would encourage a demand in the Eurozone as a whole, and it would correct the imbalances between the periphery and the centre, which are becoming more prevalent over the course of the crisis. Now, as to the second debate we need to conduct, well, this ties in with what the ECB is doing outside the scope of its mandate. This is, of course, related to austerity policies that we are currently going through. I'm sure all the members and myself are aware of the role the ECB had in the recommendations and even the handing down of measures to member states when it comes to budgetary policy and when it comes to labour market measures, and also when it comes to public services, tax policy, privatisations, and so on and so forth. There were a whole raft of recommendations and impositions handed down to member states. In the current context, I think it would have been preferable to have public policies to kindle growth rather than what was imposed by the ECB. Just to round off, what is required is to look more at certain points as to the actual running of the ECB. There are two matters I would like to raise just very briefly. Firstly, the members of the board of the ECB. This debate has been conducted in this very committee, and once again we need to go back to it because there is a lack of gender equality in the upper echelons of the ECB. Very few women. Second matter to be raised is how the ECB is run, more specifically the more and more pivotal role of the ECB. Bearing that in mind, we need to consider the various attempts which have been made to further sideline the role of the EP in decision-making processes, also involving the ECB. We already have a very limited role, whereas the ECB plays a very prominent role. That's not fair. Now, when it comes to the current context we're living in, I'd like to say the following. There are things we need to deal with, raised in this report. Firstly, for your consideration, unless the ECB sends clear signals to the market that it is being consistent in its expansionist monetary policy, what can we do? The ECB's policy is currently very fragmented. Secondly, can we continue to work with the ECB while they are trying to stabilise prices, given the current situation? I'm raising these issues because I have a great deal of misgivings about the course pursued by the ECB. But I'm just chucking these ideas out for your consideration. I'm more than happy to listen to what you have to say on these issues and any others you may care to broach.